Okay. Welcome everyone to another edition of COA Social Book Reads. On behalf of President Habib Khan and the Council, who are supporting this significant forum where authors, architects are invited more to kind of search for the scholastic dimension of the practice that enriches practice. And today we are glad to have Professor Jaimini Mehta with us. Welcome, Jaimini, and looking forward to your talk, and then we could ensue into a dialogue. There are quite a few questions that even young architects and students had sent. So we have kind of collated. The others would be posting on the YouTube, and we will kind of collate them as the dialogue moves. Yeah. The theme of the dialogue today is 50 years of Manthan. Professor Jaimini Mehta is a practicing architect and an independent academic based in Baroda, India. He studied architecture at MS University, Baroda, graduating with Professor M.B. Dave Gold Medal at the university, and at the University of Pennsylvania with an honors in the studio taught by architect Louis Kahn. And this is in the mid-60s, sometime 1965. He went on to work in the offices of Louis Kahn and Michel and Giorgola in Philadelphia and New York before setting up his own practice in India in mid-70s, 1975. His architectural work has been exhibited in New York, Mumbai, Baroda, and Ahmedabad. He contributes regularly to the ongoing discourse on architecture through articles and books published in India and abroad. In 2018, Professor Mehta won the JK Architect of the Year Award in the category of literary architecture. Professor Mehta's talk today will be largely around his scholarship, condensed in the several books that he has authored, and we hope to dialogue on the books and probably look at a certain trajectory of how post-colonial architecture in India has unfolded as well, while that's not the main focus. And the books, in a sense, have complemented Professor Mehta's practice and project. They're like two parallels that complement one another. So there have been 4 books have been published, 2 more awaiting publication, as well as a recent series of explorations on social media. And I would urge young architects, heads of schools to engage with the YouTube channel that Professor Mehta has set up with a series of dialogues. I think it is broadcast every Thursday, which I would request later Professor Mehta to share with us. But this has been like a parallel practice. This is an expression of Professor Mehta's belief that knowing and making, scholarship and skill, theory and practice constitute the essential binary of architecture. And I think the first YouTube post or the video which has been posted, in a sense, deals with these issues in more elaborate terms, in terms of what these binaries of theory and practice mean, with also its historic antecedents. So I would endorse or urge viewers today to also access the YouTube channel, which really has what we are going to dialogue in much greater depth being posted. Professor Mehta believes that every project or every discussion can trigger or open up new avenues for exploration in enriching both architecture as well as a sense of life in general. So do join us today to invite Professor Jaimini Mehta to talk to us on 50 years of Manthan. Professor Mehta, please begin.
Thank you, Nandan. I will start by giving you some sort of a general sense of what writing means to me. In addition to being a practicing architect, I have not built huge amount of built work, but whatever it is has been informed by a continuing search or research that you can, I would rather call it search only. And both that as well as the work has sort of, both sides of the coin has fed each other. When you confront a situation while designing a building, an issue comes up that you have never really faced before or confronted before, and you want to know more about it. So you sort of go into details as to what it is and why is it that I want to understand that much more. That has led me to think about that issue in a much more theoretical or historical sense, opening up other ways of doing things. At the same time, while talking to a student in a school or a colleague, generally a point is made, somebody brings up an issue, a student is struggling with something, and he raises a question that triggers an idea that one sort of sits home quietly and explores, and that leads to further investigation into what is behind that. We generally, when we do architecture, we sketch, we explore through sketches. When issues come up, I explore through writing. I start writing down, not because I know something, but because I want to know something by bringing it outside of me. Once it is written down, you can look at it objectively, you can interrogate what it is, and you can sort of take it further. So writing for me has been a search. And all these 6 books that I have, 4 published, 2 unpublished, each one of them has given birth to the next one. In the sense that while doing that book, something has come up which needs to be taken further, and for which a route has to be found out. It sort of leads to another set of ideas. To give you an example, the book on Khan, which I was engaged in from 1970 to 75, it took us 5 years to do this book. We were confronted with 3 challenges. One, of course, was the very personal, very poetic and philosophical language of Khan himself, which was always, though very, very disciplined from his point of view, was difficult to understand for most of us lay architects. When he talked about silence and light, or when he talked about a lot of other things, order, so we did not really know how to comprehend it in the kind of a modern vocabulary and terminologies that we were used to. So the first challenge was to understand that and put it in a way that doesn't necessarily violate his simplicity, but at the same time makes it more comprehensible to others. But in that process, an issue, a very important issue came up, is that is of historicity, that modern movement, which was very prevalent in the 60s, had sort of relied upon to develop a language of science and technology related architecture, rational architecture. Khan had placed himself, for example, in modern, throughout that time, we kept on thinking that architecture has evolved throughout history. From the beginning, which may be primordial, to later on to the Greeks and the Egyptians and so, to Gothic and Romanesque and Renaissance and modern. So there has been a historical progression. Khan had placed himself outside that history by calling himself belonging to the volume 0 of history. Not one, not last, but even before history, he was looking at the essences, not the historical validity of his decisions, but the essences of decision. And so, in order to do so, I had to actually undergo a couple of years worth of research on what modernism means. What are the metaphysical and philosophical foundations? What are the ideas that inform modern movement in architecture? When I say I'm a modern architect, what does it mean? Does it mean certain kind of shapes I build with? Does it mean certain technology I use? But there must be some kind of a larger narrative that has to be consistent with modern architecture, which takes on the form that Bauhaus took, or Le Corbusier did, or Frank Lloyd Wright did. How do we understand that? So modernism, to understand, was a search that Khan's book led me to. It took me 25 years later, when the second book, Rethinking Architecture, came up, in which the questions that are not really fully articulated in the first book, I began to explore. That also involved looking at the conception of space, which is actually the way we understand space as a Euclidean space, X, Y, Z coordinates kind of thing. That is actually not an eternal universal conception of space, but it was born during Renaissance and has developed simultaneously with the development of the modernism. So that also became a issue that I had to sort of explore much more. That led me to writing the book on Fatehpur Sikri later on. It's about Fatehpur Sikri, but it's also about the space of Fatehpur Sikri. Because that architectural event of 1590s, 16th century, late 16th century, was before Renaissance, before the invention of perspective, before the way we started thinking about space. So the question was, what was the sense of space that Akbar and his craftsmen were exploring? So each of these books throughout has led me to, and continue to lead me to, areas which are still unexplored. And so the search goes on all the time. There are very crucial issues that concern Indian architecture. And I have, in the last couple of books, the sense of history and the non-aesthetic modernity, have touched upon that, as to how do we understand this notion of modernity in the Indian context. Are we modern, and what is the relationship between our traditions, which are still valid, in the light of our aspirations to be modern, and that aspiration to modern, how do you reconcile with the traditions? So those are the things that it's still being explored. So the books, see, when it comes to books, most of us, especially as architects, expect the books to have a lot of visual material, beautiful pictures of beautiful buildings, connected with or supplemented with some critical writing, some explanation, but not much. There are critical books. There are books written by historians and critics, but they are far and few in between, and not much more appreciated beyond academia. My series of books fall into that second category. It has been, yes, there are architectural examples, there are images, but they actually complement the ideas that are being explored. So I think the books have to be read. And I believe our education system should also be set up in such a way that students develop a habit of reading. We generally look at very beautiful images, get impressed by that, but we do not understand what are the ideas that inform those decisions. And I want to focus on that. I want to make sure that our students, our young architects, begin to understand that.
Now, Professor Mehta, if we can go back to the 60s, well, maybe in the next 45 minutes, let's try to, because the books in a certain sense are also recording or stating a certain kind of shift that has happened from maybe the 60s to today, in various ways. And when you write about rethinking modernity, or let's say one says we need to rethink, it then naturally goes and refers back to the 50s and 60s, where we were not rethinking modernity, but we were thinking modernity. That there was a free nation, we had got our independence. The Prime Minister had invited Le Corbusier to plan and design Chandigarh at that time. IIM Louis Kahn was invited at that time. So there was a certain anticipation or promise of what this new way of thinking that we today call modern, or as opposed to, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 years of tradition, which was there in a certain country. And then what happens is that there is a perceivable break of a certain kind, whether we acknowledge it or not. There was a certain break. It may have been in the nature of institutions, when you suddenly get Indian Institute of Management, or you get any of those institutions, the IITs that were created. So it was a certain promise of a new nation, in which the modern project or the idea of modern architecture took root in India in a certain way, and took root almost with state patronage. At one level, there was a state patronage to it. So when you say rethinking modernity, how does it enrich? Is it a change of direction and course? Is it that we missed out on something? What do we mean in specific terms? Because we have students now who are right from first year, third year, and fourth year who are also engaged in this dialogue. And I think if there can be a value where they can take it back into their studios, and the design studio would be great. So let's take it as if it's possible. If it's not possible in the dialogue, it doesn't matter. But if it is possible for a third year student or a fourth year student, now has a project that has been given to the student to maybe design the new Indian Institute of IIM that is being considered in one of these new cities, how would they rethink this idea? How would they, because at one level, the value of Louis Kahn, the value of going back to what he called the essence, and in a sense, a very monastic essence. There was a rigor of structure, there was a rigor of light, there was a rigor of program. I don't think he called it functions, but there was a programmatic rigor where the act of inhabitation was revered, was sacred. How a human being inhabits the building was a sacred act. It was not a functional act that you just sit and type something, or everything had a certain reverence to it, a certain respect to it. And therefore, there was a kind of rigorous understanding of what is material, what is structure, what is light, what is a human need beyond function, and how does that translate into a place of learning? So when we talk about rethinking modernity, and you bring in the idea that maybe in Fatehpur Sikri, I know that when the Festival of India happened in the 80s, Padmanabhapuram or the temple in Madurai, uh, Mandu, all these had become Jaipur, had all become certain references to go back to, certain notions of architecture that we believed emerged in the subcontinent. We need not focus on a national boundary here. It emerged in a subcontinent. Whereas modernity, did modernity end up making architecture functional? Did it end up making architecture merely efficient? Was there something lost in the process, or how do we reclaim it in this idea of rethinking?
Nandan, yes, it's a very good question, very important question also. Excuse me. In order to do so, I think we have to understand, we have to go back to certain terminology, certain vocabulary. Modern, modernism, and modernity. This is when I begin to rethink modernity, I went back to what is it that we call modern? Modern is that which is contemporaneous, that we do in tune with the time we live in. Okay? Today, we do something which seems contemporaneous for us today, but in an African tribal society, they may have something which is something new for them, which may not be what is new in Europe or in India or in Rajasthan somewhere. So the question is, modern is something which is universal as aspiration of all civilization, all society. And that is what is meant by modernity. It's a noun. Modernism, and it is the thing that around Renaissance, through the invention of telescope and the change of worldview, where from Earth being the center of the universe, it becomes heliocentric, Sun being the center of the solar system, the entire worldview changed. And it became clear that only reason can give you right perception, not perception itself. So the whole idea of modernism became a kind of a political project. I use the political in a much more broader sense, as a public project to bring about a rational organization of both human society as well as human knowledge system. And it became such that science and technology were seemed to be the only rational domains of human knowledge, and therefore it was believed, it was supposed projected that everything has to be scientific or follow the methods of science and technology. So modernism is that. That modernism has run out of its course. And now it began to sort of be questioned around the mid-60s, where I was in America. Actually, the decade from 60 to 70, 2 decades, were some of the most sort of provocative, stimulating time to be in that part of the world, where this whole basis of modernism was being questioned. That why does architecture have to follow science? Are the methods of architecture same as that of science and technology? Do art and architecture think differently? It was at that time that people like Khan and the whole group of people around him, Jargula, Venturi, Geddes, Mechard, etc., as well as a young group of people in Europe, Van Eyck, Beckema, the Team 10 group, they had been questioning this intensively, extensively. And it was this that you can begin to see emerging in the work of Louis Kahn, whereby he rejected this whole notion of looking at architecture as rationally sort of justifiable. He talks about validity, which is outside of that. So that the whole notion of modern itself being questioned, but modernity continues. Modern may have been over, and we are now talking about postmodern. That postmodern implies that rational modernism has run out of its course. It was a kind of a ism which had lasted for about half a century, but it's now had to be replaced with something. We don't know yet what, and therefore we only call postmodern, but reality. There's nothing after modern, because of anything that is after modern is new modern. So the idea of modernity as being contemporaneous still continues. And this is something that I began to explore, and I realized my very important discovery was that concerns India was that language, which is the source of knowledge, dissemination, has a very important role to play. We consider that modernity or modernism came to India from Europe. And we consider that the Golconda House is probably the first modern building in India. I question that on several counts. One is that, yes, the modernity or modernism that was developed in Europe during Renaissance based on the science and technology, rationalism, came to, which can be known as the Enlightenment modernity, because it was the period of enlightenment throughout Europe. It was the vernacular modernity of Europe, which was rooted in that society, in that culture, but came here. However, an organic or vernacular modernity was already on its way in India, which has to do with local languages. We had a phenomenal knowledge system based on Sanskrit earlier, which was suppressed and replaced by English. But Sanskrit itself was only used by very few people, elites, and so was English. However, simultaneously, there were Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati, Tamil, Kannada languages going on, and they continue to. And they had been in touch with a new wind that was coming in, especially in the coastal area. Excuse me. And they kept on changing, evolving, making new things. The Nalikattus of Kerala kept on being built. The wonderful Chettinad houses in Tamil Nadu continued to be built. The Havelis of Gujarat and Rajasthan continued to be built. So these were actually vernacular modern, because they were new. They had incorporated ideas that is coming in. And therefore, when you look at contemporary Indian architecture, and my sense of history books looks at it from independence onward, you realize that there are two parallel streams going on. One I call the way of Tagore, the other I way of Gandhi, in which the tradition, which are thousands of years old, have been sort of upgraded, made contemporaneous, and made modern, which is the way of Gandhi, while accepting the Enlightenment modernity that came from Europe has been accommodated with existing tradition. But the focus remains that of the international language of architecture, which I call the way of Tagore. And these are the things that I have explored much more in the series of lectures that are coming up. So there is a narrative. This way of looking at it, looking at through language, and what is the sort of interaction between tradition and the modern ideas, ideas that came from other part of the world and ideas that are rooted here, gives us a narrative to talk about Indian architecture, which has not yet been explored. And I look at the work of, say, Habib Rahman, Kanvinde, Charles Korea, Hasmukh Patel, several others, as well as Baker, Doshi, Raje. From what point of view? That how do you actually, is there a narrative to structure their work in terms of how they interacted or how they resolve the relationship between tradition and modernity?
Sure, I think this is really opening up several other trajectories now. You know? The fact that, and then I think it's a provocation to go back and begin to assess the lessons of the past in a certain way, you know, because we've been by and large often in history been comfortable compartmentalizing history in certain slots and not necessarily taking it to a point where the motivation or the causal reasons on how those elements came about, how those organizations came about, how that kind of an architecture came about is not, because we straight away move to giving them labels, giving them name, we call modern, we call it tradition. And sometimes in the act of giving the name, the content of what does it mean or what are its characteristics may be lost in the history book. And I'm just kind of provoking another question, because if one were to then re-examine, you know, because I will for a moment leave aside, I'll leave it for a later conversation at some point, because otherwise it will get so the part where Gandhiji or Tagore and all come in could be the substrate of the beginnings of a modern conception, you know, and that's something contemporary, something modern as really the substrate. And as you rightly stated, the Golconda probably becomes the first expression of a modern architecture that has been transposed from the European context, you know. And today the dialogue that is on across the world is the need to look at what is the architecture that was more appropriate for the subcontinent, more appropriate for a region, rather than borrowing architectures from other regions. It's not that borrowing an architecture is right or wrong. We're not getting into that question right now. But how do you, if we were to, let's say again for a third year student or a fourth year student, and one were to kind of try to elaborate, if it is possible, certain attributes or certain features or aspects of an architecture which is appropriate for this region, an architecture which you probably condensed in the research on Fatehpur Sikri, as well as your travel across various, even in Baroda or Rajasthan, or where we are kind of, you know, absorbing the nature of or the manifestation of that architecture, which relates to a social and a cultural context.
I think, I know you raised a very important issue. uh, it is time we really look at Indian architecture from a different perspective. I think we need to rewrite the history of Indian architecture. Right now, it has been written by Ferguson, Minister Fletcher, etc., etc. They have taken the historical progression as the narrative. But for example, while researching Fatehpur Sikri, I found out that there are instances there which were truly, thoroughly modern at that time, which has never been explored. What is known as the Raja Birbal's house, for example, has a plan form and has an architectural composition never been done in India. So it was a kind of a new way of looking at things. People must have looked at it and say, Maharaj Sahib ne kuch naya kiya hai. The same way in Jaipur, Hawa Mahal, the typology didn't exist. And there's a name for an architect attributing that design, plus Jantar Mantar itself. If you think about a scientific architecture, you can't find better than that. But it was something that is so new, people would have looked at it and say, Maharaj Sahib ne kuch naya kiya. So these were new, modern. Can we look back at our history and look at from that point of view as how architecture has evolved, whereby from a tradition which did not really give authorship to anybody, begin to give authorship, and that is where this is one of the markers of modernity, of being an author, attributing something to an author which thinks differently, which sort of changes a course of history from one direction to the other, and therefore brings in modernity. So Indian architecture has so many such examples, whereby you can actually begin to see that people have been experimenting and doing something new. And so from that point of view, and if people in the council are listening, I said there should be a project to rewrite the Indian history, get good scholars and commission writing of Indian history in a different way. I think we should do that. Because there has been instances whereby things have evolved. And as I said, the residential architecture, which we do not attribute to anybody, but there has been tremendous innovations going on in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in Gujarat, in Bengal. Bengal temple architecture also has evolved. The terracotta has images of British soldiers on temples, as much as Khajuraho has images of Apsaras. So isn't that modern? Isn't that something new? Whereby the information and knowledge that has come from other sources have been incorporated into our architecture. So I think those are the kind of things that should provide a narrative to understand Indian architecture, even modern contemporary Indian architecture.
Sure, I think that's an suggestion which we could, after the end of this conversation, take it on, and I'm sure the council and several heads of schools are have been tuned into this, because that's a feeling I think for several years now everyone has been carrying, that there is a need to reassess the history of the land from an indigenous point of view, rather than an other or an outsider's point of view. And if we are going to relook at it from an indigenous point of view, then language will become one of the most important substrates of that conversation. We couldn't be all the time conversing in English and say, let us look at architecture. Or
other countries of Europe and everywhere, people have a single language. You have French in France, Spanish in Spain, Italian in Italy, etc., etc. India is the only civilization where you have multiple languages. So you have a dual two-layer knowledge system. One that was sort of explored in Sanskrit, the classical language, which got replaced by English, but the other was vernacular. And that continued to modernize while the Sanskrit was replaced by English. And we, those elites who were talking and thinking in Sanskrit, began to do that in English. And so English knowledge, literature, science came in. The vernacular was continuing going on. It was not interrupted. I don't subscribe to the idea that Macaulay changed the knowledge system in India, because there was a parallel knowledge system continuously going on. So I think language is a very important thing for a country like India, for a country meaning as you said, the subcontinental area, where knowledge becomes, the language becomes a vehicle of knowledge dissemination.
Sure. I think there is also maybe a parallel situation happening, that one, yes, there is an evolution of science and technology. The other is there is a new nation which is shaping or emerging. So one is the architect at that time, let's say architect Kanvinde or architect Raj Birbal, architect Charles Correa, Professor Doshi, Laurie Baker, at that point are actually as architects confronting a situation where they are being drawn or even at times being challenged to design completely new typologies. Like Indian Institute of Management, completely new typology. And Indian Institute of Technology that architect Kanvinde is addressing is a completely new typology. And since you're bringing this up on the reassessment of history, I think it may be good to just bring a certain event or a transaction here, that when Le Corbusier came into India, architect Kanvinde had already built in concrete several projects. He had already dealt with these materials. You know, we have a kind of a wrong interpretation that concrete came in with Chandigarh. Architect Kanvinde, and if I'm not mistaken, Professor Doshi has even written on this fact that Corbusier requested and visited Professor Kanvinde's buildings to understand what the language of concrete holds as a promise in India. You know, and I think that's a significant kind of a moment where someone like Corbusier finds it important to visit buildings designed by architect Kanvinde to get a sense of the structure, to get a sense of how it is built, the expression of the column and beam and the building itself, and also a climatic notion. You know? So I think a rewriting of that history from various accounts, including what architect Laurie Baker was immersed in terms of his expression. It was not really something, as we are in the schools we present, that modernism happened in Europe and it was kind of came into India and we absorbed it. I think there was a much deeper dialogue in this process, and it had different parallel expressions. And so which I think your conversation brings up. Let me come back to now the second part. So there was one part is this new nation, and we have the first generation of architects who are kind of dealing with this new nation. There was a lot of promise and a lot of energy with it, new typologies, and largely state-driven. But I recall a time in the early 90s. I had just graduated at that time, and I think that's the first time we officially met, you know, early 90s. how 32 or 33 years have passed, I'm not able to uh, account for, but nonetheless, they've passed. I had just graduated, and you were at that time in New York. And if I recall, you had returned to India for a certain phase where there was the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the New York School of Architecture, doing an India program, and which was kind of curated or formulated by you, you know. And so I remember that because of your generosity to invite me to be one of the visiting faculty in that studio. That was my beginning point where Professor Varki had invited me. And in your own, if we go back to that phase, because that phase is the second inflection. I'm just stating certain points. I'm not going to stand by it. It's just to give. So if that was the point where India was going to let go of its socialist ideology. That was the point where across the globe, we found the internet had just come. So the internet had an impact on the way architecture is conjured. Way of life changed because then we had large software parks coming in for the first time, which had not been visualized. The nature of an architect's practice dramatically changed from hand drawings to AutoCAD and all these other kinds of forms of digital drawings. So there was tremendous change that was happening at that time when you returned from New York. You were in India, and so how would you see that shift between the 50s and 90s, where there was an architect? Because most of your books, I sense, and I'm now being a little provocative, I sense are urging the reader to say that there is a lot that has happened between the 60s and 90s, and we need to maybe revisit, you know, and that's the kind of latent message I get in some of the books that you're writing. I'm not saying it's only 60s and 90s. It may be even the fact that we need to go back even further to understand the lessons of history. If the practice of architecture has to be more relevant in society today. It's not about style. It's not about modernism, postmodernism, deconstruction. I don't think we are getting into that. We're really looking at how does architecture become more relevant? How does what is designed respond to the needs of the society at that time? And in what way does it respond? How does it understand climate? How does it understand material? How does it understand just how communities live, you know, and which, so I think that's the, so in the 90s, there was, literally changed the way of life.
Yeah, actually, the action point was, you're right, in the 60s or early 70s. And I remember I was in New York at the time when the students of architecture, both at Harvard and at Columbia, revolted. They actually occupied the campuses. I was teaching at Columbia, and I remember that the students were asking, and Giancarlo De Carlo has recorded this in a beautiful way. The students are asking for the purpose of their preparation. You know, they're saying that what are we doing as an architect? What is the purpose of this training that you are giving us? It was also a reflection on the hollowness of that so-called modern movement in architecture, which has lost its social responsibilities, etc., etc. So yes, that was the time when world over a sudden shift occurred, and this is an event in the I think when it began in France in the school, the Beaux-Arts, equal to Beaux-Arts, and then it spread to America also. So it began in Europe, essentially. Everywhere, these architecture students began to question. And the seniors, the faculties and the older architects had to respond to that. Okay, that's one thing. Second, when we talked about Corbusier and Kanwinde, and I think it's very important to understand that Kanwinde comes from a school of thought, which is Bauhaus. He, as well as Habib Rahman, went to Bauhaus and brought Bauhaus here. I think Bauhaus has a greater influence on Indian architecture than Corbusier. Corbusier was highly personal, and except for a few people, difficult to follow his language or way of doing it. But Bauhaus came and got rooted in India with the help of Kanwinde and Rahman and others. And at the same time, Charles Correa also came from MIT, which was the same area, Harvard, MIT, kind of thing. So that they brought that aspect of modernism, the so-called international style, not internal, but I think the Bauhaus was a little bigger than that. So that, but Kanwinde has also recorded that soon enough, in about a couple of decades, he realized that Bauhaus was too constraining for him. He need to look at what Indian architecture is about, what is appropriate to India, not Indian architecture in a historical sense, but what is appropriate today for India. And so his architecture also had, from the early buildings, the Atira building, for example, to the IIT campus at Kanpur, there is a shift. That shift talks about, or clearly shows the internal churning that was going on in Kanwinde's mind. And he was looking at the other direction. And that direction sort of took over later on from his dairy projects. I have dealt with this in my last book, Sense of History, and explored this shift itself. The major thing that I also found out in the 90s is something which is still can be questioned, but I think I'm convinced about this, is that from mid-40s, from the beginning of the independence until 90, there was this kind of a sense amongst everybody, me included, that India has to have its own identity. In order for India to present itself in the world, there must be an Indianness of things. And architecture, not consciously, but subconsciously, architects were looking at a language with which India can be represented. So there is a kind, this is why I subtitled the book, Architectural Representation of the Idea of India. It was happening from 90s onward, from your generation. That pressure is sort of dissipated. Now it's much more a global thing. And I think that's a shift that also needs to be explored far more.
Absolutely.
And the new architects, young architects, your generation, and several others, your contemporaries, are already doing that. They're less concerned about sort of quote unquote Indian architecture than architecture with a capital A. And I think that is a wonderful shift. Yeah.
No, I think yes, I would agree that the issues that are coming up probably need a parallel dialogue in some other forum, or it needs because these are all questions that finally have an influence on the pedagogy in a school of architecture, what is conveyed to a student as history, and then because that eventually shapes the formulation or predilection of an architect when a young architect, when he comes into practice, or when he or she comes into practice. So very often what happens is that in the absence of I would say this dual dialogue where one looks at drawings, one looks at plans, one is engaged in the act of construction, one is almost the manner in which architect Laurie Baker professed, that you know your material, you know what is to be constructed, you understand the climate, one understands the site, the programmatic needs, the aspirations of a client, and that in that context, in that reality, uh, discuss the scholastic. In that reality, because I recall one conversation in Ahmedabad with architect Charles Correa, and in his mood at that time, I'm going by a certain mood also. He may have shifted the thought later. There was a belief that uh, there is a slow and gradual tendency now that many of the architects in later years in attempting a PhD or attempting higher are moving more towards description, conversation, and language. And it is separating itself, and which probably is happening in many American and European universities also, that there is a language of how architecture is spoken and where it is distancing itself or becoming further and further away from the act of construction. That how construction happens, how a beam is cast, or why does it take a certain form? What is the validity of a structure when, let's say, Khan decided that this is the nature of that structure, this is the nature of that opening, or how were those decisions taken more from the act of making, the act of construction, because to Khan, so I'll come back to Khan more from another point of view, that he was, and since you have done the book on Khan, there was a feeling last year that certain principles, now I'm using the word principles because there was a large audience, I don't use those words, but certain architectural principles that Khan kind of explored or engaged, which then gave an expression to his architecture, which as you stated, did not fall in the flow of the modern movement. It was not going to have a free plan, or it was not going to have ribbon windows or whatever. It's there, it was, but he was really drawn to maybe Mandu. He may have been drawn to maybe, of course, Carcassonne and Rome and architecture in Italy, which was one of his derivations. And from there, trying to say that this should be the nature of architecture. So when you were working on the book, could you share again, keeping the third year and final year in mind, could you share what were those shifts that Khan felt he could not engage in the mainstream so-called, the contemporary architecture that was happening at his time, but he made a shift.
Yeah, that. It's again a very important theme to explore. One of the casualty that architects suffer through modernism is the separation of architecture and engineering. The whole idea of thinking through construction got separated. Engineers, the civil engineering discipline happened in mid-1700, and sort of architecture was left to sort of rethink its own identity. And I think that is the beginning of this notion of abstraction and the kind of language that Charles was complaining about. And it's really very prevalent even today. If you look at a lot of literature, they are highly intellectualized, removed from construction, removed from the act of making. And it is this that intuitively Khan brought back together engineering and architecture. For him, like for example, Richards, it's a very good expression of how architecture was thought of as a system of construction. His notion that decoration or ornament occurs through construction is exactly to say that detailing has to be thought of with certain reverence, not through abstraction. So that the one of the major difference between the modern movement and what Khan was proposing or advocating was that it is the construction that is the kind of a spine that holds the architecture together, and not structural engineering sort of thing that engineers are there to do. But you have to start thinking in terms of how things are put together, how you actually assemble things. Not just the beams and the columns, but even the little things, the fabrics of this building. How does it come together? That actually is one of the things, one of the contribution of Khan, which is not really acknowledged as much.
Mm.
And when you see IIM, for example, the fact that he found a language of making windows and the tie beams and all that is his way of expressing construction. Because he was thinking through construction.
I think that's another significant attribute or aspect, which I think in another longer or a separate conversation we could have, because it begins to impact the way in which we look at the act of design, look at the act of construction, look at material and understanding of material. And I think expression of a building or all that come as more a refinement or a outcome of that process. They don't come as a visual decision taken then fitted on. It's not a reverse. It is coming from an understanding of structure, understanding of the requirement of the program, the material in the region that is chosen. So I think that we could have because we've kind of run through an hour. So I was just trying to see that the last few, there are a few questions which have come from the audience as well. In today's time now, I think this question can be linked to the fact that through the pandemic, you decided also to create now a certain platform on a digital platform. It's a YouTube channel where all these issues, because each of these issues we spoke, we could probably speak for much longer, but we are so the channel really is dealing, your channel is dealing with each of these issues from your perspective. And I'm sure there are others viewing who will have who may resonate with your perspective or who may disagree with your perspective. But I think that's the beginning of a healthy discourse on the relevance of an architect and its place in society. So to that extent, we are grateful that enormous investment of time, experience, and content has been kind of condensed to create this YouTube channel. So could you speak about what do you think or how it can kind of complement the schools of architecture, the different studios that are there, in the kind of conversation or content that you have planned for the channel, alongside the books? And it could probably then enrich the studio, it could enrich a discussion on history, it could enrich a discussion on construction or Khan. Could you please share that?
When I started doing this, it was not intended to make a point or convey some ideas to the schools or anything. For me, it was a simple question of bringing my ideas to as wide an audience as possible, not because I think I had the right answer for the questions that we all are struggling with, but once it is out in the open, others can think about it, they can accept, reject, modify, take it further, and a dialogue could begin. I think one of the things which was at the back of my mind, and I've been talking about it in the school, you may remember it also, is that we have very little critical culture in India. In our education also, the way to look at things critically, that is not as a negative thing, but critically through the distance. Think about it, explore it. That somehow is really missing in our education system. That is one of the things that we architects, I find, don't have this habit of reading. And that is one of the things we try to introduce at SET, which the school that you went through. So I began this thing partly out of a frustration that my last two books were not being published. The publishers were sort of thinking about it, but they were looking at the resources. So I said, look, I'm going to use this wonderful fora that now the technology allows me. It's like the Greeks and the Romans going to that forum and talking to the public. So it is a way of being in the public, to bringing something in the public so that it can be shared. How other people will use it, how schools will use it, teachers or students or architects will use it, I don't know. I have no way of doing. But if it triggers something, if it provokes something, if it raises a question, and if a teacher is being confronted with the students with a question that might be difficult for her to answer, say for example, I might have done my job. So, I mean, the whole series of 12 lectures sort of emerged more or less unplanned. It sort of went on and until it happened. I didn't even know how I was going to broadcast it or not. It was there. The two young assistants helped me with social media, which I did not know anything about, frankly. But I know a little bit about. But I think I find that now this technology replaces or sort of brings in another form of the agora or the forums.
Yes, absolutely.
To which we can bring out, we can be in a public. To which, I mean, I think the word politics is very important here. It comes from the word polis, P-O-L-I-S, not the police that we are afraid of all the time, but polis, which means to be or to act in public for public good. So this is one way of me being in the public.
Thank you, Professor Jaimini Mehta. I think while we have come to the end of the talk, we've spoken for about 1 hour, 20 minutes. I hope that everyone participating has got a sense of the books. There was one on Khan, the other on modernity, and I would say a seminal work on Fatehpur Sikri. And I had the opportunity of reviewing few of the books for the Hindu as well. So I would say, let's keep an open mind to continue this dialogue, either in this forum or another forum, because the issues that have been raised on the relevance of architecture, an understanding of construction material, space, and how these have kind of manifested in different times from maybe medieval times, the 1500s, and when during independence, and now the 90s. I think does call for a much deeper discourse if architects have to rediscover another kind of relevance in society today. So that schism that you mentioned, also the schism between engineering and architecture, where an architect may be more or less perceived now to be dealing with only the visual aspect. And so I think these are misconceptions which need to be addressed largely within society. And while your books are kind of speaking to an architectural audience, to young architects, schools, I hope this opens up many further dialogues. And thank you for setting up that the YouTube channel, which can be accessed by all. And I'm sure there'll be several schools who would like to access the YouTube videos that you're making on these different themes that we've discussed. And so if you want some closing on where are we heading, or do you see some premonition or intuition of how do we reinforce relevance of an architectural practice in a very challenging condition of society that we are all in? A few words and then we could probably close.
I would only say that let everybody watch those 12 sessions, and then I would like an opportunity to interact with whoever wants, because I think ultimately it's a question of provoking thought. And if the schools want me to interact with the students or anybody, I'll be very happy to do so.
Sure. I think through the COS Social Reads, we would attempt to take it to several schools who have also indicated interest already. So we will maybe come back to you when the schools, and especially fourth year, final year is what you had suggested because of the nature of content also. So I think through COS Social Reads Forum, when schools take it up at dissertation level or thesis level, the schools will come back to you. We've spoken to a few heads. So thank you, Jamini, and it was wonderful discussing and provoking this whole idea of critical thinking that actually enriches the act of construction. It's not about a parallel academia or a conversation, but that it has to bring back and come back and refer to the act of construction, and that the two are actually binaries of the same body. They're not, I think in an earlier lecture, you spoke about the risk of separating mind and body. And I think that's what often happens, that theory starts running a parallel story and construction runs a parallel story, and there's not necessarily a meaningful conversation between the two. And what is being discussed here is that there is a need for conversation, and maybe in the next one, if it can be with a few images and slides, not because it's only fascinating, but in one of your lectures, I recall, I think in the discussion on Hannah Arendt, you were actually discussing that when she talks about the need to express, the need to convey, the need to discuss or dialogue like this, we are necessarily moving into public space, or we are moving into a collective. Yeah, it's not some dialogue or discussion where we are sitting in our rooms and speaking to ourselves, which is what this is. But the the digital forum allows us to engage with public space, and that need to engage with public space for an architect needs to be accompanied with images. I think that's what you had also stated, that we could look at some point in time, because your own lecture series otherwise generally carries a whole range of images, but because this is a dialogue, it wouldn't have been easy to relate images and flow with the dialogue. But I think the need to go back to images, go back to drawings, go back to representation, go back to construction details, go back to materials chosen. And if we can kind of open that at some later time, we would look forward to it.
I will. Thank you.
So thank you, Jamini, and on behalf of the council and COS Social Reads, thank you again, Jamini, for that wonderful conversation. And I thank all our viewers also. Good night. Thank
Good
you.
night.